I'd like to welcome our next guest, our next presenter, Michelle Tobias. Hi, Michelle.
Hey everybody.
Hey. Yeah, I last ran into Michelle at Phosphor North America, where she was teaching people how to make maps with QGIS, how to make maps with pens. Um, she's a geospatial data specialist at UC Davis, cartography expert, and an author focused on map design in Python. And feel free to take over the screen. She's here to tell us about how to use QGIS to make better maps, cartography tips and tricks.
Awesome. Hey everybody. I'm super excited to talk to you about this. It's one of the things that I absolutely love, and it was something that I was actually working on this morning with some cartography and QGIS. Um, you might be thinking like, hey Michelle, this is PostGIS Day. Why are we talking about QGIS? And the answer is because you can connect PostGIS databases to QGIS, and it's a great way to visualize your data. I'm just going to get into some of the things that I think about when I'm making maps, and also things that I teach folks who come to my workshops and, ask me, how do I fix this map? So these are some of the key concepts that I think are really important. So I think it's really important to tell the story. So before I do anything in terms of cartography and making a map, I really think about like, what do I want my readers to learn from this map? When they look at it, what should they be getting from this? What claims am I trying to support with the map that I'm making? And in general, like, what's the story that I'm telling? Another really important thing is to minimize. We are only going to keep the things that are absolutely necessary, and everything else we're going to get rid of. And finally, focus on communication. Does my map communicate well? Am I telling the story that I want to tell? And am I communicating the things that are important? So let's dive into these three things separately. So telling the story. First up, we really need to define what story are we trying to tell? Why are you making this map in the first place? We're not just throwing layers, onto um, a map canvas and saying there we're done. We're really trying to make sure that we understand why are we making this map and what should the reader learn from it. So before I do anything else, I'm answering these questions. So the example map you can see on the screen is a map that I made for a professor at UC Davis to go into a book about political actions that were happening around cinemas in Paris in the early part of the last century. And so the story that we're telling with this map, and the story that the professor asked me to tell, was how can you get from one cinema location to the other using the metro line? I guess the story behind this is that there was political actions happening at these two cinemas, and the assumption was that you couldn't have the same person couldn't have caused both events to happen the way that people were claiming, because it was too close together in time. You couldn't get across Paris to get between these two sites that quickly if you're using the road network. But the answer is you can do that if you take the metro line. So that's why we are making this map. And that's the story we're trying to tell, is like, you can do this on the metro and it's actually pretty quick. So then we need to, once we figure out what our story is, we have to figure out what data do we need to tell that story. So I will sometimes just actually make a list of everything that needs to go into the map. I'm going to think about what's my focus data, what's my background data, and do I need to do any data processing? So for example, in this example map, the focus data is the cinema locations, the metro lines, and the metro stops. The background data is the streets. Like, that's less important here, but we still need that for people to be able to understand this map and sort of orient themselves and kind of get a sense of scale as well. Scale bars are great, but most people, like, they're not that intuitive. Um, so so those are the data sets that we need. I don't need other data sets here for reference. I just need these four. But also with this map, we needed to do some data processing. I had the cinema locations were provided as addresses, so we needed to do some geocoding to put those addresses on a map. And then because these were addresses from like the early part of last century, we also needed to check really closely for accuracy because some of the street names had changed. So there's a lot more than two addresses in this data set, but there's only two on this map. So there was some that needed to be done by hand. Okay, so the second concept is to minimize. So less is definitely more when you're making good maps. And we're going to focus on two aspects of that today, which is our fonts and our map elements. So starting with the fonts, we want to maximize readability. And the way we're going to do that is we're only going to use one font, maybe two at most. So don't go wild with the fonts. You're going to really try to use just one. You can use different font variants like bold and italic, light, things like that. And you can see some examples of the different variants of Proxima Nova. That's just the font I was using in this presentation. But you can kind of get an example of all the different types of variants you can have with just one font. So you don't need two fonts because you have all of these variants of the one you're choosing. We're also going to tend to pick a sans serif font because they are visually nice and simple. So like you can see the font I'm using here in this presentation is sans serif. It's very clean lines. If it was a serif font, it would have like, think about like Times New Roman as a classic serif font. It has little like wings or little flicks at the ends of like the letters. Like if you think of like the capital T in Times New Roman, it has little swooshes on it. And that just adds more visually. So it's better in most cases to choose a sans serif font. Not that there isn't a place to use serif fonts or novelty fonts, but mostly we're going to choose sans serif fonts right now to make it nice and clean. The other thing is font size. So tempting to use teeny tiny fonts because then we can fit more onto our map, but it's really hard to read a font that's smaller than 8 point. So don't do that. I honestly try to keep my fonts 10 point or higher if I can, because otherwise, if I start at 8, I'm going to want to go down to 6, and that's just not going to be readable. Some things with QGIS specifically that are helpful to know is when you're working with text, you have a lot of options for how to style that text that you may not have thought about before. And these tips are going to give you some other ways to make your fonts look different, even though you're going to only have one font in your map. So when you're, for example, doing labels in the layer styling panel, you can uh, label your maps, the way that you normally would. But there's some kind of, I feel like, hidden features in here that are easy to miss. So you've probably seen this text tab where you change the name of the font, and then you can change the font variants like to bold or italic or things like that. That one's, I think, pretty well known. But some other ones like the formatting tab, the second one from the left, I use a lot of the features here. So letter spacing is one that I really like. I will space my letters out for things like state names or country names. So it's the same font, but I'm changing the amount of space between individual letters. And that just kind of gives it a different feel. It takes up a little more space. Um, it just looks nice for big names like that. The other thing you can change is word spacing. So essentially, this parameter changes how wide your space bar character is. So if you hit space bar, it's going to make a wider space than it normally would if you change this and make it bigger. Or you can make it smaller if you want the words to be closer together. So two different things, letter spacing and then word spacing. Another one that I really like is this wrap on character parameter. So a lot of times I've got long labels and I need to break them up. So you can either like put in, a character that is kind of nonsense. Like sometimes I'll put in like 3 asterisks, or in this case, in the example I'm showing, I'm wrapping on the character comma, and so it actually replaces the comma with an end of line character, so it wraps the text, and that can be really helpful if you want to do things automatically and not have to do a lot of editing of your attribute table. And then the final thing that I like to change in this particular interface is the line height. So in the example here I'm showing, I'm making the line height larger, so I'm increasing the space between the lines, but a lot of times I actually make it smaller so that I can visually group the lines that are for the same label. I feel like sometimes the default with QGIS is that it's a little bit taller than I want, and visually it might look like two separate labels. So I'll decrease the line height, and then they kind of smush together a little bit, and they look like they're one thing rather than two separate labels. And then finally, in this uh, labeling tool, the rendering tab is really important because it has the parameter for what to do about overlapping labels. And my personal preference is to tell it to overlap without penalty. I want it to pile up all the labels and put them there regardless of if they sit on top of each other because I want to hand place them. A lot of times I don't like the automatic labeling for a map that's, professional. If it's just like a quick reference map, I don't care that much. But if this is going in, like, for example, a book chapter, it's got to be right because it's going to be there forever. So I want it to label everything and then I hand place the labels. There's some really nice tools in QGIS for moving labels around. But I will say if you have to do a lot of label moving, get a gaming mouse. It's going to help with precision. It's going to make a lot less work on your wrist. So yeah, highly recommend the gaming mouses for cartography. So the second part of simplifying things is map elements. Map elements to me feel like clutter. So I know like when I used to teach intro to GIS, we'd always say like, you always have to have a title, you have to have a north arrow, you have to have all these things. I'm going to tell you now you don't need all that stuff most of the time. So we're only going to keep what we absolutely need in our maps, and figure out, does the reader get this information somewhere else? And consider the context of the map itself. Like, is there more information in the text of like if this map is going inside of a report or inside of a book chapter, for example, does it get context from that text that someone's going to be reading and then referring to the map? So in the example map that I have here, you'll notice that this is a map, but it doesn't have a scale bar. This is a map of Arizona, but there is no Arizona outline here. There is no title. There is no north arrow. And the reason for that is that this appeared in a book chapter that was about Arizona wines. So there were other Arizona maps in this chapter. And so people could reference those to understand the relationship of the spaces that we're talking about. Um, and they've seen maps where the American viticultural areas, the AVAs that are represented here, they show up on other maps. So they have a sense of the spacing here. So we took out all the extras. And partially that was so that we could zoom in more on this and give more detail because it's a really complicated map. There's a lot going on here. It didn't need more stuff. So we do have a legend because otherwise you would never know what all of this stuff is. But we took out all of the things that were not necessary to tell the story because it needed to get because it's a cluttered map, it needed to get simplified, and also it had that context of the text that goes along with it, so we could take things out. And the point of this map is to show that the places where the wine is being produced, the AVAs, is different from where it is being consumed. So the lines connect the businesses that sell the wines to the places that are making the wines, um, which you would know if you had actually access to the book chapter to read it. Um, and so finally, we're going to talk about communication. Every map element, everything you put in your map needs to communicate precisely. So we're going to talk about two things, visual hierarchy and background data. So visual hierarchy is kind of the way our brains work. It helps us understand how we notice things and how we don't notice other things. So the first thing I like to talk about is contrast. So items with high contrast compared to the items around them will convey more visual weight and also importance. So if you look at the example image that I have on the screen, you will probably quickly gravitate to one or the other of the lines within each of the boxes. So probably on the dark background, your eye is drawn to the lighter line, and on the white background, your eye is drawn to the darker line. And that's because they have more contrast, and so they have more visual weight. You're going to notice them first. Our brains are wired this way, so we're going to work with that. We're not going to work against it. um, and sort of a secret uh, thing that's going on with these images is that the lines here are the exact same colors between the two sets, but they look very different because of the amount of contrast in the background color behind them really changes the way we perceive those shades of gray. So again, high contrast means in our brains, more attention, more focus, more importance when it comes to a map. So we're going to work with that. Another thing about visual hierarchy is size. You know this, like you notice the big stuff first. Like the text on the screen in the sort of right side panel, you read that sentence completely inside out, I'm sure, because big text jumped out at you. So larger things, again, have more visual weight. They convey more importance. This is just the way our brains work. So again, we're going to work with that. So you'll notice, if there's wider lines or bigger circles, you're gonna notice that first. So when you make a map, work with that so that you make the big things, the important things, and then your reader notices that first. The final piece of visual hierarchy I'm going to talk about is color saturation. So again, saturated lines or saturated colors, ones that have more intense, more vivid colors as compared to like pastel colors are going to give more visual weight and feel more important. So the richer, the more intense the color, the more attention we're going to give it and the more it's going to feel more important. So we want to use saturated colors sparingly. And I know when you start up like QGIS, it just picks random colors, and often they are all very saturated, and that feels very overwhelming. So the first thing you can do is mute down your colors, and it'll be a little bit easier to work with. And the concept of color saturation is related to contrast in terms of visual hierarchy. Sort of the more contrast, the more saturated something is, the more attention it's going to get. And then one of my pet peeves is background data. Sometimes people talk about this in terms of like base maps, but I think that term gets used to mean a lot of different things, so it's not super precise. But whatever data you're using in the background of your map, I want to remind you to check your license information. So even like tiles and things like that, that you can just plunk in your map, like quick map services in QGIS is great because you can get a really quick background map. Great reference information, but check the license on that data. You may or may not be able to use it for your purpose, especially if it's a commercial purpose. So check that before you just decide to use any base map or any tile service. Now for static maps, most of the time I am going to grab my own vector data and style it and work with that rather than tiles. I think a lot of pre-made tile services and also air photos contain way too much information for most of the stories that I'm trying to tell with my maps. So I'm going to grab my own data, like OSM data is great, and style it the way I want it, filter it to only the things that I want to see. So I actually spend a lot of time on my background data that really is not going to get noticed very much, but really tailoring it to what you need is helpful. And the same thing with interactive maps, where you probably do need to use a tile service as your background, base map kind of data, but make sure you're choosing a tile service that is conveying what you want. So there are some really nice simple ones out there that don't have a lot of information versus like I always think of like dropping like a Google Maps layer in there where, like when I'm making a map of Paris, do I really, in the mid part of the last century, do I really need to know where all the modern McDonald's are? Probably not. So you want to think about like what is that background data giving you too much information? And finally, I wanted to go through a couple of examples of maps that I've made in QGIS, and then I think the last one I'm going to show you. I did some work in Inkscape to put some things together, but just to show you some examples of work that I've done and show that you can make some pretty decent maps in QGIS. I do most of my cartography work in QGIS. So this is an example of a map. If you've done my cartography workshop, you've made something similar to this. This is lake monsters according to Wikipedia, zoomed into the Great Lakes area. And you can really see how visual hierarchy is working here. We're working with contrast. where the important things, the lake monster names, are black and they're bold and they stand out. And then the other information, like the lakes, which are important for this, and the state names, which are less important, kind of have a gray color to them. They're more background information, so they have less contrast. We're using a lighter shade of gray for those. Here's an example using color and how saturation can be really helpful for conveying information. So these are the potential places that the Central Pacific Railroad could have been placed, kind of in the Tahoe area in California. And so the background data here, the topo lines, the watershed boundaries, the rivers, the lakes, those are all kinds of shades of gray or kind of bluish gray. But the rail lines are really saturated colors. They stand out, they're bold, because that's the point of the map. We need that other information to understand the context of the rail lines, but the point is the rail lines. So those are the ones that we use with the saturated colors. Here is another map from that set from the Paris book. This is the map that was going to go in the frontispiece. So like right when you open the book for reference, so you could see all of the different cinemas and where they were in Paris. So you can use that as a reference as you're reading the book and just figure out like, any given location is clearly placed on this map for reference. And then finally, this map is from the publication about my QGIS plugin literature mapper, explaining how it works, taking some of the data that came out of that tool and turning it into not only a map, but also a graph of sorts to understand how latitude relates to publications. And again, you can see it's a grayscale map, but we're using differences in contrast, how dark things are helps separate out the information so you can see it clearly on top of California coast is pretty complicated. So having the points be dark helps make those stand out. And then changing the point color based on the year also. So that is what I have. I think we've got time for questions, and I'm happy to do that.
Lots of time for questions. Questions in the chat. Stefan Keller asks, is there an open source alternative web app framework to Esri's story maps?
Oh, yeah, there's lots of them. I like Night Labs. It's pretty simple, but that one's one of my favorites. I don't really build a lot of story maps in my work, so if there's other things folks can recommend that are listening today, pop them in the chat. Yeah.
I was wondering, I was really taken by the example maps you just showed, whether you think whether you feel like black and white cartography is like a good learning exercise to like deliberately force people into a stylistic box they have to fight their way out of.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes like I also dance and do choreography, and sometimes there it's really apparent that if you put restrictions on what you're allowed to do, it actually can spark more creativity. So like you could do grayscale, but you could also just do like, decide like, oh, I'm only going to make a map in shades of green, for example.
Right.
It can really help you kind of dig into some of your creativity. But also if you like, I work on a lot of academic publications, so things that are going in like journal articles. And a lot of times publishing in color costs more money. So we
Right.
end up doing grayscale just to keep the costs down.
I was actually going to ask you about that Paris map. Like, how hard
Mhm.
was it to resist making the Seine blue?
Oh, like this one.
Yeah.
I don't even think we put water in this one.
Oh,
Um, but yeah, I don't have a choice. Like if I was gonna put water in here, I probably would make it just a really light gray so that it,
yeah.
was different. But yeah, but that really um, wasn't a part of the necessary story on this. So also it's this one, these maps, a lot of the academic publications I'm doing are like 4 by 4 inches. So they're really
Ooh.
small.
Yeah.
It's like definitely like you're probably seeing it on your computer screen way bigger than it got printed. So
Is
um,
that part of your process to like squeeze it down so it's on your screen similar to how it's going to be on the page?
yeah, like QGIS will let you like when you're using the map composer, when you set your page size, there's an option to size it to be 1-to-1 scale. So it'll figure out how big it is in real life. And so then you can really see, like, wow, I need to make my fonts much bigger.
Right. It's
Because,
always
like,
my problem.
zooming in, you're like, oh, there's so much room. And then when you zoom out to 1-to-1 scale, it's like, oh gosh, I can't read this anymore.
Yeah. Teeny tiny. Awesome. You had some pretty strong thoughts about titles, legends, and scale bars. So,
Yeah.
I, what's your take on lead lines?
Oh, like when you're labeling, like
Yeah.
I use them sparingly. Sometimes you can't avoid them, but I think also like folks should realize, like I said, I'm making really small maps usually because of the kinds of maps I'm being asked to make. So try to avoid the lead lines because they just add one more thing. So, when it helps with clarity, they're great, but mostly I try to not do that. Um, yeah. And they also get tangled really easily in QGIS. If you have them crossing and stuff, they become really
Mm.
hard to read.
All right. I don't see any more questions. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and tell us about QGIS and cartography, Michelle.
Awesome. Thanks. I'm glad to have been here.
Yeah.